The legal process in general, and the figure of the lawyer in particular, are both so popular in mystery and suspense fiction today that it's easy to assume that this has always been the case. In fact, it took a long time for the genre to become interested in anything that happened after the apprehension of the criminal. Why? You can blame the detective. As long as the genre was focused on the activities of the detective, whether classical or hard-boiled, then everyone else, including the police and members of the legal profession, were likely to remain in the background. The detective focused his or her efforts on discovering the identity of and/or catching the criminal. Once the narrative reached that point, the story was basically over, and anything that happened afterward was a mere detail. Today, the situation is very different. Mystery and suspense narratives featuring lawyers are more popular than ever before. In this lecture, we'll look at the origin of the courtroom drama and the legal thriller, and we'll discuss why legal dramas have remained so popular for such a long period of time over a variety of different mediums. If you asked most people who they associate the term courtroom drama with, they'd probably say Perry Mason. There's no denying that Earl Stanley Gardner's famous creation had a huge influence on mystery and suspense fiction with a legal emphasis. But there's another figure I regard as equally influential, but who goes practically unread today. Ephraim Tutt. Who, you ask? Although very few people read the Tutt stories today, at one point they were enormously popular among American readers, and they blazed the trail for the appearance of lawyers in the genre later on. Tutt was the creation of Arthur Cheney Train, a Harvard-educated lawyer born in 1875. Train began his career as a writer in 1904 when he was the assistant district attorney for New York County. Fascinated by the human drama that he saw around him every day in the city's legal and prison system, Train wrote a mystery story entitled The Maximilian Diamond that involved the theft of the Mexican crown jewels. Train's story was published in Leslie's Monthly, and he soon became a regular contributor to several glossy, rather than pulp, magazines. Most of what he wrote during the early part of his career consisted of short stories inspired by aspects of the law. But Train also became known for writing nonfiction that attempted to shed light on the workings of the legal profession. And in all of his work, he used a straightforward and uncomplicated narrative style that won him many readers. Train conceived of Ephraim Tutt, his most famous creation, in 1919, and he once described him in the following terms. Spiritually, I suppose that Mr. Tutt is a combination of most of the qualities which I would like to have, coupled with a few that are common to all of us. One critic has disposed of him by saying that his popularity is due to the fact that he is a hodgepodge of Puck, Robin Hood, Abraham Lincoln, and Uncle Sam. I'm willing to let it go at that. What exactly does this critic's description of Ephraim Tutt mean? The most important feature of Tutt that explains his popularity is that he uses his knowledge of the law to protect the average person. In a typical Tutt case, he becomes involved in a situation where an ordinary fellow is out of his depth because he's being victimized or scammed by an unscrupulous, wealthy individual or corporation. Although Tutt himself has something of an aristocratic demeanor, his inclinations are decidedly populist, and the resolution of the narrative usually involves his winning a resounding victory for his client by means of perfectly legal but also ingenious trickery. Here we should note the similarities between Tutt and the classical detective. Like Auguste Dupin and Sherlock Holmes, Tutt usually only takes cases that appeal to him because they're unusual and challenging. Moreover, like the philanthropic Holmes, he'll often represent people who can't afford to pay him, simply because he believes in justice so strongly that he can't bear to see it abused by the unscrupulous and greedy. The fact that Tut was such a huge hit with readers can be explained by a combination of several factors. His eccentric personality and appearance, the way he consistently stuck up for the underdog, the way Tut's stories were always based on a kernel of truth about the law, which gave them an air of realism, and the fact that the stories he appeared in usually concluded with a very unambiguous resolution in the form of a verdict that exonerated his client. Beginning with the publication of Tut and Mr. Tut in 1919, Train went on to write over 100 stories featuring Ephraim Tut, which were reprinted in 14 collections. But Train's 1943 book featuring Tut, Yankee Lawyer, the autobiography of Ephraim Tut, undoubtedly had the biggest impact. Even though Tut was by this time a very well-known fictional character, Train went out of his way to make it appear as if this were Tut's real-life autobiography. Tut's name, rather than Train's, appeared on both the title and the copyright page, and Train had Tut appear to converse with actual figures, including Calvin Coolidge and Edith Wharton. In fact, even Arthur Train himself appears in the book. Tut's autobiography set off a firestorm of controversy because readers simply refused to believe that it was a work of fiction. Even though Train published a disclaimer, people wanted this fictional character to exist so badly that they ignored Train's protests and insisted that this kindly, erudite, and quietly heroic lawyer had to be real. Before the world had ever heard of Perry Mason, Ephraim Tut showed writers of mystery and suspense fiction just how popular lawyers and the legal process could be with readers. Moreover, Tut's success was also proof that readers felt that the law was often abused at the price of justice, and that ordinary people often needed someone to protect them not only from criminals, but also from the law that was supposedly on the side of the innocent. With these points in mind, let's now turn to the work of Earl Stanley Gardner and his character of Perry Mason. Between them, they took the genre of the courtroom drama to new heights. Like Train, Gardner was a lawyer by profession, but by all accounts he found the practice of law rather boring. In his spare time, he began writing pulp fiction and published his first story in 1923. Over the next few years, Gardner wrote an astonishing range and amount of fiction, and he set himself an unbelievably high word quota of 1,200,000 words a year. His pulp series characters included Lester Leith, a parody of the gentleman thief tradition, and Ken Cornin, a lawyer who is in many ways an archetype for his later creation of Perry Mason. It's also important to note that Gardner's later fictional creations include Doug Selby, a district attorney who Gardner presents as brave and very good at his job. So Gardner also wrote about the legal profession from the point of view of the prosecution rather than the defense. Despite the fact that not all of Gardner's characters were defense lawyers, given the success of Arthur Cheney Train's Ephraim Tut, we shouldn't be surprised that Perry Mason, a defense lawyer, is easily Gardner's most popular fictional creation. Like Tut, Mason speaks to the reader's desire to make sure that the legal system works ethically and successfully to protect the little guy from being exploited. Gardner worked as a full-time lawyer until the publication of the first novel featuring Perry Mason, The Case of the Velvet Claws, in 1933. After that, he devoted himself to writing full-time. The phenomenal success of his most famous character, who eventually appeared in more than 80 novels and short stories, was a big part of the reason why Gardner was able to dedicate himself to his work. Mason's description of himself in Velvet Claws tells us a lot about the reasons for his popularity. You'll find that I'm a lawyer who has specialized in trial work and in a lot of criminal work. I'm a specialist on getting people out of trouble. They come to me when they're in all sorts of trouble, and I work them out. If you look me up through some family lawyer or some corporation lawyer, he'll probably tell you that I'm a shyster. If you look me up through some chap in the district attorney's office, he'll tell you that I'm a dangerous antagonist, but he doesn't know very much about me. This quote indicates that Mason is a controversial character among some members of the legal profession because he has a reputation for fighting hard for his clients. Like Ephraim Tutt, Mason is also something of a detective as well as a lawyer. He's attracted to difficult, if not impossible, cases, and is often driven by intellectual curiosity rather than the desire for money. Indeed, in some cases, he even finances his investigations himself if the client can't pay. Mason is motivated not only by the desire to win, but also by the desire to see justice done. In The Case of the Drowsy Mosquito, Mason defends himself from the accusation that he sticks up for criminals by saying, "I have merely asked for the orderly administration of an impartial justice. Due legal process is my own safeguard against being convicted unjustly. To my mind, that's government. That's law and order." Mason's defense might seem self-serving, but in fact, it's the key to the success of both this character and the novels and stories he appears in. If readers had felt that Mason was using his knowledge of the legal system to undermine it and let criminals get off scot-free, there's no doubt in my mind they would have rejected him very quickly. Instead, what readers see in Mason is someone who recognizes that there's sometimes a gap between law and justice. Mason makes sure that no one falls into that gap, and that's what people love about him. But the other reason for the phenomenal success of Perry Mason has to do with an aspect of Gardner's work that we also find in Arthur Chaney Train's Tutt stories, but which Gardner develops in much more detail. In short, Gardner appreciates the fact that the courtroom can be turned into a stage, and he exploits the theatrical potential of the legal process like no one else before him. The best evidence of this fact is Gardner's fondness for the cliffhanger ending in a Perry Mason story. All of the Mason stories are highly formulaic by definition. Critic Russell Nye has identified the following unvarying elements in a Perry Mason story. The case is introduced, Mason investigates, Mason's client is accused of a crime, there's more investigation, followed by the trial, and then the dramatic last-minute introduction of new evidence that resolves the case. It's this final element in particular that became the hallmark of a Mason mystery, and it indicates that, among other things, Perry Mason tales are as much works of suspense as they are of mystery. Even though we know Mason will eventually win the case, exactly how and when that's going to happen is in doubt right up until the last minute, and the resolution of that suspense gives us much pleasure. The other reason Earl Stanley Gardner and Perry Mason are so important to the genre of courtroom drama is that they demonstrate how well these stories can be adapted to the medium of television. Although a number of film adaptations of Perry Mason novels had appeared in the 1930s, this figure achieved even greater visibility starting in 1957 thanks to the television series Perry Mason, which starred Raymond Burr in the title role. The original TV series ran until 1966, and then Burr reprised the role for a series of made-for-TV movies between 1985 and his death in 1993. By accentuating the dramatic and theatrical aspects of the legal process, Gardner had already made the courtroom a highly visual space, even in print. The television series simply translated that theatricality into visual terms. Thanks to both Perry Mason the series and to Raymond Burr, who quickly became synonymous with Gardner's famous lawyer, the character of Perry Mason became an even more indelible part of American popular culture. Even as Gardner's novels, many of which provided the source material for episodes in the television series, started to go out of print, the syndication of the television show kept Mason in the public eye. The influence of Perry Mason on both the courtroom drama and the representation of lawyers in American culture more generally cannot be overstated. Thanks to Mason, I would argue, the reputation of the American legal system was rehabilitated. Although lawyers continue to have a somewhat ambivalent reputation in American culture, defenders can always point to Mason as an example of what the profession can and should be. The American Bar Association announced in 2015 that its publishing imprint, Anchorwick, would begin reissuing Gardner's Perry Mason books. What a fitting tribute to this author's influence on the legal profession. What happened to the courtroom drama and legal thriller after the very high benchmark set by Earl Stanley Gardner? Part of the answer to that question involves jumping across the pond and visiting the United Kingdom for a moment. In 1978, a series entitled Rumpole of the Bailey debuted on British television. The series starred the actor Leo McKern as Horace Rumpole, an elderly and eccentric lawyer who works as a criminal defense lawyer at the Old Bailey, England's Central Criminal Court. The series proved to be so popular that it was not only repeatedly renewed, but it also inspired a series of books that were based on the television scripts. Both the scripts and the books were written by John Mortimer, a lawyer and author who wrote in a range of different genres. The popularity of the Rumpole character is interesting for a couple of reasons. First, the tone of both the TV show and the books is very different from American courtroom dramas, and that's because of differences between the two legal systems. Perry Mason's cases were usually murder trials, and this was regarded, not explicitly but implicitly, as necessary in order to make the outcome of the trial sufficiently high stakes to hold the readers and later the television viewers' interest. That's not the case with the Rumpole stories. Although they often feature serious crimes, much more attention is paid in both the television and novel versions of these stories to characterization, and especially to the eccentric habits of the lead character. This means that the British version of the courtroom drama can often bear a much closer resemblance to so-called cozy mysteries than the hard-boiled atmosphere that usually characterizes American legal thrillers. This illustrates the way in which the courtroom drama can be quite a flexible genre, taking in and adapting itself to variations in legal standards and practices in a manner that makes it, potentially at least, quite a portable genre. The other notable feature of John Mortimer's Rumpole stories is that they began on television and then migrated into books, rather than the other way around. This suggests the possibility that after the success of the Perry Mason television series, other media were now in a position to lead the way in terms of producing courtroom dramas and legal thrillers. They no longer had to depend on mystery and suspense fiction writers to first produce source material for them to adapt. In a moment, we'll discuss some more evidence to support this statement. But before doing so, we need to acknowledge that in the post-Perry Mason era, legal thrillers are still very much a force to be reckoned with in mystery and suspense fiction, as we can see in the work of two of the leading practitioners of the genre, Scott Turow and John Grisham. Scott Turow has put his background in both creative writing and law to very good use in a series of novels that are all legal thrillers set in the fictional Midwestern setting of Kendall County. Turow is known for drawing upon the same pool of recurring characters in his novels, which not only gives his work elements of continuity, but also serves as a canny marketing strategy that keeps readers coming back for more. This has proved to be a wonderfully successful strategy for Turow, who sold over 30 million books over the course of his career. There are a number of continuities between Turow's work and those who came before him in the genre. Like Gardner, Turow frequently portrays the legal system as corrupt and self-serving. Unlike Gardner, however, Turow doesn't put his trust in a single maverick crusading lawyer in the Perry Mason mold to save the day. Why not? Because Turow believes that the system is too powerful and complex for any one person to triumph over it. For this reason, his novels are just as likely to portray lawyers as victims, rather than champions of the rights of others. In his first novel, Presumed Innocent, for example, prosecutor Rusty Sabich is accused of the murder of his fellow prosecutor, Carolyn Polhemus. Over the course of a long and labyrinthine plot, Sabich is eventually found innocent, but not before having to confront the fact that loyalty and affection mean very little when you're assumed to be guilty rather than being presumed innocent. In both Gardner's Perry Mason novels and in Turow's work, lawyers are the protagonists, but in a very different sense. Mason works for others, and in that respect, the reader isn't particularly interested in Mason's background or history. In fact, we learn very little about him. For Turow and his ilk, by contrast, the lawyer is our main character, and consequently we learn everything we could possibly want to know about him so that we can sympathize with the difficult situation he's in. This difference doesn't necessarily make a Turow novel any less formulaic than a Gardner novel, but it does mean that our attention is focused on a very different place. In the earlier version of the legal thriller, the lawyer helped the innocent to escape the clutches of a corrupt legal system. In Turow's hands, the lawyer, him or herself, is more likely to be the one who needs help. The careers of Scott Turow and John Grisham seem so similar that the only difference is one of scale. Grisham has published much more, and the 275 million copies of his work sold dwarfs Turow's sales figures. Their work shares many similarities. Just as Turow explores the idea of the lawyer as victim, Grisham takes this idea to its logical conclusion in his first best-selling novel, The Firm. In this novel, young and ambitious lawyer Mitchell McDear joins a law firm in Memphis, Tennessee, mostly because of their very generous salary and benefits offer. Mitch's dream of becoming the youngest partner in the firm's history, however, is derailed when he finds out the firm is connected to organized crime, and that any lawyer who realizes this is killed off. At this point, Mitch turns into a combination of both detective and lawyer, as he works to accumulate enough evidence to turn over to the FBI so that they can prosecute his bosses while also figuring out how to stay alive in the process. The happy ending to this drama helped to ensure the success of both Grisham's novel and its subsequent film adaptation starring Tom Cruise. In the process, Grisham both solidifies the legal thriller's view of the legal system as corrupt, even murderously corrupt, while also extending Turow's presentation of the lawyer as the victim rather than the crusading hero. At this point, it would have been easy for Grisham to keep reproducing the same formula and thus guarantee further success. But to his credit, he's used the genre to explore a range of social issues, including vigilantism and racism in A Time to Kill, and political corruption and environmentalism in The Pelican Brief. Even more unusual for a mystery and suspense fiction writer, in 2010 Grisham began publishing the Theodore Boone series, legal thrillers for children that aim to both entertain children and instruct them about certain aspects of the legal profession. This most recent work from Grisham suggests that legal thrillers can be taken in a variety of different directions if the author is willing to think outside the box. In closing, I'd like to return to a comment I made earlier about John Mortimer's Rumpole of the Bailey, which is that Rumpole began first as a television series and only later became a series of books. I think there's evidence to suggest that the courtroom drama and the legal thriller have now liberated themselves from the context of mystery and suspense fiction, as it were, and now exist on their own terms. In the American context, two developments in particular helped this shift come about. The first was the launch of the Court TV cable television network on July 2nd, 1991. The programming on Court TV, which was renamed True TV in 2008, was centered on live transmission of legal proceedings with commentary from legal experts, and was a game changer for courtroom dramas and legal thrillers. Why? Because it allowed the American public to become better informed about the American legal process than ever before, and to appreciate the theatrical dimensions of the justice system more vividly than ever before. Both of these trends were intensified tremendously by the second development that gave the legal profession a much higher profile on American television, and that's the trial of O.J. Simpson, which ran from November 9th, 1994 to October 3rd, 1995. Probably the most highly publicized trial in judicial history, the Simpson case allowed Court TV to come into its own, and the decision to allow cameras in the courtroom during the trial not only influenced the outcome of the trial itself, but also changed the genre of the legal thriller forever. In my opinion, the best evidence of this influence can be found in a television show that actually began before either Court TV or the Simpson trial, but whose popularity exploded thanks in part to these phenomena. I'm referring to the Law & Order television franchise and its various spin-offs. The original series was launched by Dick Wolf in 1990 and has since expanded across a variety of media, including TV, films, video games, and adaptations of the series formula in a number of other countries. What sets the various iterations of Law & Order apart from the other materials we've discussed in this lecture is the fact, by and large, the audience now views the legal process and the justice system largely from the perspective of the prosecution rather than the defense. The presumption of innocence, the notion of the justice system as corrupt, and the preponderance of wrongly accused individuals that dominated earlier examples of the genre are now all pretty much gone. Instead, the police and the prosecutors are now the heroes, the thin blue line that protects us from hordes of viciously violent super predators who always seem to be on the verge of escaping just punishment. If the suspense in early legal thrillers and courtroom dramas was generated by the prospect of the innocent being falsely convicted, now it seems what we fear is the prospect of the guilty getting away. What led to this seismic shift? That's a question with no easy answer. But I would point to the persistent perception among the American public that violent crime is rising, whereas it's falling, and that they're likely to be victims of violent crime, whereas the odds are very much in their favor. In other words, today's courtroom dramas and legal thrillers are both symptoms of and contributors to the overrepresentation of violent crime in our media and popular culture. It's this overrepresentation that potentially has a variety of damaging consequences for the way in which we think about crime and victimization. And yet, there's some reason for cautious optimism. Documentaries such as Making a Murderer and the podcast Serial are both examples of contemporary legal thrillers that are still wrestling with and confronting the imperfections of our justice system. As long as that search for justice continues, the influence of Ephraim Tutt and Perry Mason will persist.